Hello again. Have you ever been into a band or bought some music by a particular band or an artist where you think, I'm buying it because somebody else says I ought to, and you never quite get it, even after you keep going back and trying and trying and trying some more? Well, today I'm going to talk about a band and a particular album that represents that sort of experience for me. Um, and I was inspired to do this video because I was watching a video by Norman Maslov, I think it is, in San Francisco. He's a San Franciscan, and he loves English music of the 60s and many other bands and artists, of course. But he's a big Beatles fan, and he talked about the Kinks. And I thought, oh, the Kinks. Yeah, what experience have I got of the Kinks? Well, let me tell you my story with the Kinks, really. The Kinks music. When I was growing up, I started buying records in about 1972. And in those days, I was buying, Benny Hill or Gary Glitter records, Status Quo, Roy Wood, and I was just starting to branch out into things like Deep Purple, early 70s rock, was starting to get my attention. And then, of course, as if you've watched me and this channel before, you know that I was starting to buy Genesis records as well. And but the Kinks just kept being written about in the music press. So he has me looking at the Melody Maker or Sounds, which was my favourite newspaper stroke magazine of the day. And everyone's keep going on about the Kinks, and tracks like You Really Got Me and All Day and All of the Night, Till the End of the Day. And it was later on, I think, when Van Halen's first album came along, and they did a version of You Really Got Me, where it was kind of affirmed or reaffirmed more strongly that the Kinks might have been one of the originators of heavy metal, the guitar riff. But in 1972, basically, you go back and listen to the something like You Really Got Me or Till the End of the Day, and you think, well, these sound really thin and tinny and really not that remarkable at all. So my journey with the Kinks music has been varied, shall we say. It all started when I used to buy these singles. I still got them. So way back when, from 72 and 73. I used to buy these singles, probably like many of us. There were jukebox discards. So they'd had their month or two on the jukebox, and then they ended up in a bargain bin somewhere on a rack, and they were being sold 50p or something like that. And it was a bit risky because some of these jukeboxes used to rip the guts out of the grooves, and so they were pretty unlistenable. But some weren't too bad. And I bought 2 or 3 singles that around this period that I still have. This one's from 1972, Supersonic Rocket Ship, backed with You Don't Know My Name. I know the A side. Sweet Lady Genevieve from 73. Sitting in My Hotel from the Everybody's in Showbiz, Everybody's a Star album, which is a good album. And a later one, 74 this one, again on RCA, Mirror of Love, and He's Evil from Preservation Act 2. But I started buying Kinks albums with this one. No surprise, budget release, double album, golden hour. So these days, us audiophile types would probably think that this, with like half an hour of music on each side of the vinyl, and this is a double, you can see all those tracks there. There's loads of them. Doesn't sound so great. Doesn't sound so bad either. So it wasn't only this that I was judging the Kinks on, but I had this album for a little while, and I didn't really buy anything else, and I wasn't that bothered about the Kinks. But, in the early 70s, you had DJs on BBC Radio 1 like Mike Reid, although he was probably more of the mid-70s, when he came to prominence, just couldn't shut up about the bloody 60s, and always going on about the Beatles and the Kinks and the Rolling Stones. And, these, in 2022, I can look back and think these are good bands, produce some fantastic material. and I can respect them for what they are and enjoy their music really a whole lot. But back in the day, Deep Purple, Genesis, loads more bands were coming to prominence, and you had all these nostalgia types keep banging on about the 60s. It was really tedious. Anyway, so I just left the Beatles and I left the Kinks in particular alone for quite a number of years until this album came along, Schoolboys Disgrace. So this is the album I'm going to talk a little bit about today. So apparently this cover, I think it was Rolling Stone or something like judged it to be one of the worst album covers of all time. But it's quite distinctive, you'd have to say. There you go, there's the back cover. And this is interesting here. So what they've got, the blurb on the back cover. Once upon a time there was a naughty little schoolboy. He and his gang were always playing tricks on the teachers and bullying other children in the school. We've all been there. One day he got himself into very serious trouble with a naughty schoolgirl, and he was sent to the headmaster, who decided to disgrace the naughty boy and his gang in front of the whole school. After this punishment, the boy turned into a hard and bitter character. Perhaps it was not the punishment that changed him, but the fact that he realised people in authority would always be there to kick him down, and the establishment always put him in his place. He knew that he could not change the past, but he vowed that in the future he would always get what he wanted. The naughty little boy grew up into Mr. Flash. Now, apparently Mr. Flash is a character that Ray Davies wrote about in a couple of albums called Preservation Acts 1 and 2, which I don't have, and I can't say that I've heard. But I bought this album undoubtedly on the back of a number of favourable reviews at the time, although I have to say, when I do these videos and talk about particular albums, it's not unusual for my selection from a particular artist's catalogue is the best or commonly regarded as one of the best albums. This is not from the Kinks catalogue. When you look through discographies and kind of overviews of the Kinks career and their releases, you often find that Schoolboys Disgrace is just a footnote. Nobody says anything about it. But it's an album that I still kind of really enjoy, and I thank to Mazzy Maslov for triggering me into picking it out of the rack again. So, having established that the Kinks seem to be really overrated as a band, it wasn't until, with those really tinny mono singles from the early mid-60s, it wasn't until the 70s came along and I started buying those singles, and notwithstanding that that compilation that I've just held up, I started to listen to other stuff by the Kinks. And although I didn't buy it until later, this is a reissue, this one. I've got an original of this one somewhere, but I can't quite put my hands on it at the minute. But this is Everybody's in Showbiz, Everyone's a Star. And this has got an absolutely fantastic track called Celluloid Heroes. Wonderful track and a wonderful album. So there was stuff coming out that was of interest to me. And as I say, Schoolboys Disgrace came along. And what can you say about it? Well, for the first time for me, I was beginning to hear the guitar of Dave Davies sound like a rock guitar, not just some tinny early 60s, kind of cheap replica of a guitar, which is probably unreasonable. But it was the stuff in the 70s in that Everyone's in Showbiz album, and then this album, and then of course of a number of others in between, no doubt. The band started to sound a whole lot stronger, and they were better produced. You could hear the full, much more of a full dynamic range. There was lots of bottom end, and the guitar riffage was quite strong. So it began to show itself in this particular album, and so. But there's a warning here. So there's a warning with this album. Last night I I decided that I was gonna finally talk about this album on video this morning. So I listened to this album again last night, and even though, just let me pause a second. The point I was going to make with albums like this, Everyone's in Showbiz, there's a way of, isn't it amazing this, that you can kind of just take a different attitude to a band and hear them differently, almost like for the first time. So as much as I've said about the 60s, early 60s mono stuff being kind of really tinny and thin sounding, if you approach the, well, in my experience, if you approach the Kinks as, especially the early 70s stuff, as a band that were doing similar stuff to what the Beatles were doing in albums like the White Album and Abbey Road, really quite varied, you begin, and strong, undoubtedly strong, you begin to think about them in a slightly different way. And it's easier to appreciate. But one of the things that really rams home when you think about the Kinks versus the Beatles is that Ray Davies, the singer-songwriter for the Kinks, basically had to do the work of Lennon, McCartney and George Harrison on his own. So it's not surprising that his output with the Kinks is more uneven, shall we say. Some great stuff. He's got a fantastic gift for melody, there's no doubt about that. His lyrics are great. He's got a bit of a thing about nostalgia, so there's a theme of nostalgia running through these albums from the late 60s through right the way through to here, actually. So anyway, this album, what have we got here? There's a couple of things that's worth saying. So the back cover's really neat, nice picture of the guys in their school uniforms. You have the RCA label that familiar with. You've got a lyric sheet that looks like something that's taken out of a file that you might use at school, with a very old-fashioned font. But really good, really good. Anyway, the point I was going to make, I was talking about the Beatles, wasn't I? So anyway, last night I listened to this thing, and again, because I've listened to it several times in the last few weeks, and I suddenly had this realization, is that it sounds like a Broadway or West End musical soundtrack. Not everywhere, not every single track, but there's just too much of it. Like Rocky Horror Picture Show, which I can't stand, Little Shop of Horrors type thing. You can just imagine there's a cast on stage with, dancing and singing to some of this music, which horrified me. So I thought I'm going to abandon this idea of talking about Schoolboys in Disgrace because it's too much like musical theatre. But I thought I might as well go on with it because there is some good stuff on here and I do enjoy it. So what have we got here? So it opens with School Days, which is kind of a nice, gentle introduction, setting the scene, just like a musical, I guess. Talking about, we grow up and school days are the happiest days of our lives. Well, according to some people, not me necessarily. And we should look back on them with fondness and so on. But this is a little, and it's, as I say, setting the scene. It's like a bit of it sets the scene, saying that this is like a story of this bad character who turned into, as I said, Mr. Flash. So then it goes into the school experience itself, and it's got Jack the Idiot Dunce, which really is a musical number. It's kind of fast, and it sounds like a 1950s kind of rock and roll inspired, dance number, basically. Education, which talks about the importance of education, and it's like, you can just imagine from the stage that the singers are looking at the audience saying, you better value your education, and it just keeps going on, education, and it just outstays its welcome. I think it's about 7 minutes long. The First Time We Fall in Love, which is the last track on the first side, which is, familiar story. The guy, young teenager, falls in love with another teenager, and things happen. And I don't know whether it's the truth or not, but the first track on side 2, called I'm in Disgrace, seems to be an admission that he's got into trouble, and he might have got the girl into trouble, as we used to say. And then he has to go off to the headmaster, who gives him a lesson which he calls the hard way, like learning about life the hard way. And the hard way is like really rocky, and it's kind of punkish in a way. And it's a sort of track that in 2 or 3 years later, so I should say this was released in 75, 76, can't lay my hands on it, what's it say on the label? 75, I think it was recorded at the end of 75, maybe released at the end of 75. Anyway, the hard way could have been recorded a couple of years later, or even just maybe around the same time by the likes of the Ramones, or Blondie, or even the Clash in the UK. It's really quite punky. Nice guitar, great riffage, really, really nice. And then you've got The Last Assembly, which is, I don't know whether the protagonist has been expelled from school, or this thing that got him in disgrace happened in his last year, and him and his school friends were kind of leaving school for the last time. And then it goes into a lovely track which more or less closes the album, apart from some sort of a reprise of that education thing at the end, called No More Looking Back, which is kind of much more of a rock track rather than a musical theatre track. Really nice, and it's kind of just about the young guy who's left school, and he's he's kind of he wants to compartmentalize his school experience, put it in the past, but he's not always able to do that because he has this image. He mistakes a stranger for this girl he knew at school, and he can't really get her and the school experience out of his mind years later. So I think it's a really good album. It's if you love musical theatre stroke rock and roll, you'll absolutely love this album. For me, was a little bit put off by that, but I still have a place in my heart for this album. Now, I saw the Kinks on this tour, and this is a program from that tour in '76, I think. So here we go, just to give you an idea. This is the sort of program that we used to buy back in the day. It actually has the lyrics for School Days, kind of setting the scene with Ray Davies. Picture Ray Davies there, and there's Dave there, and there's a little bit of the story laid out there. Tickets. So yeah, saw them on Friday, 5th of March 1976 at Newcastle City Hall, supported by a band called Splinter, I've got written on the back here. Remarkably, or unremarkably, I saw them again, which I never realised that I'd seen the Kinks more than once. I saw them in 1979, and I can't remember a thing about that concert, because I always thought, as a live band, they were pretty tedious. You know, all that kind of vaudeville, kind of showbiz type thing, just ruined the show. It was really just quite unremarkable. The Last Assembly there, it's being mentioned again, and they used to do. I mean, they used to do this extended version of Lawler, which involved audience participation. That used to do my head in. It used to seem to go on forever. And back in the day, I used to stay right to the very end, and sometimes used to go backstage, chat to the band. Not that I had anything to say in those days, but I'd grab an autograph or something like that. These days, I wouldn't hang around. If they started playing Lola, I'd probably listen to the first couple of verses, and then I'd be gone before the audience participation thing kicked in. Yeah, and at this point, I might put some pictures up on this video from, I think, the 1979 gig. I took some photographs, and they're on slides, and if I manage to get them off the slides, it'll be shown in the video right now. So, a couple of other things just before I finish here. Well, there's CD versions of just really good albums. That's Everyone's in Showbiz. This is Arthur and the Decline and Fall. Arthur or the Decline and Fall of the British Empire. That's a really good album. I bought a reissue on vinyl of that one. It's really, really good. Multiple Hillbillies is not bad either. Was it Power Man, Lawler versus Power Man and the Money Go Round. Good album. That's nearly a one Face to Face. These are all great reissues that have all come out in the last kind of 5 years or something like that. They're worth getting, loads of extra tracks and things like that. But yeah, as I said earlier, their output is very uneven, and I think it's because there's too much of a burden placed on Ray Davies. But it's one of the reasons, because of their uneven music, uneven musical output, that I've kind of, my interest in the Kinks has kind of waxed and waned over the years. It's somebody will trigger something, then I'll suddenly go back and just give it a fresh listen one more time, and maybe I'm halfway through listening to an album and I'm on Amazon or somewhere like that, and I'm ordering a couple of others because I'm really enjoying it, and then they come and then I'm dip into them now and again. It's a sort of band I would say that I listen to not because I love them, I admire them. I think Ray Davies is an undoubtedly great songwriter. But I've never really taken them to heart, really, and so it's hard for me to make the strongest recommendation of digging in, because it's hard to know where you start. I mean, there's an album here that if you listen to the critics, this album here called Something Else by the Kinks, which I think is a '67 album, is the one to go for, because this has got David Watts, which of course The Jam did. It's got closes with Waterloo Sunset, which for some reason the critics, the London-based critics, think it's a beautiful depiction of looking at the kind of Waterloo in London. But as someone from the north of England and not really experienced watching the sun go down over the River Thames or down at Waterloo Station, it doesn't really resonate with me as strongly as it does with some others. But this is a good album. Again, it's quite uneven, lots of different styles. But Something Else by the Kinks is probably where you might want to start. Because I would say, finally, I wouldn't start with a compilation like a greatest hits, because there is something about those late 60s and early 70s albums, these concept albums that Davies was putting together, that have an integrity about them, that have a theme about them, that kind of makes those connections between the tracks give you mean more, offer more than the sum of their parts, if you like, as the phrase goes. So I'd avoid the greatest hits, because I think you might begin and end there, but choose one of maybe Something Else. But certainly Everybody's in Showbiz is a great album. The Village Green Preservation Society is another one that's very, very highly regarded. And as I've said, I've got a fondness for Schoolboys in Disgrace. So anyway, I probably rambled on for too long, as usual. But there you go. I'm making a cautious recommendation for the Kinks and Schoolboys in Disgrace. See you on the next video. Thanks for watching.